Then the royal daughters were brought in, and His Majesty said to the queen, "Here is Sinuhe come as a Levantine, a product of nomads." She uttered a very great cry, and the royal daughters shrieked all together. They said to His Majesty, "Is it really he, O king, our lord?" Said His Majesty, "It is really he." The Story of Sinuhe. Ancient Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, of the great pyramids, and of the famous boy king Tutankhamun. These are the features that are most familiar about ancient Egypt, but there is so much more. Who were the Egyptians? The ancient Egyptians had a clear understanding of who they were and who everybody else was. If you were not Egyptian, you were not civilized, and this made you dangerous. How did the Egyptians define themselves? How did they define non-Egyptians? How did they reconcile the need to interact peacefully with foreigners and their beliefs that foreigners must be controlled? In this episode, I will answer all of these questions and more. I'm your host, Brianna Jackson. Join me in exploring ancient lives on the Nile. There is a king who will come from the south. He will take up the white crown. He will raise up the red crown. The Prophecy of Neferti. It is generally accepted among Egyptologists that the ancient Egyptian civilization lasted over 3,000 years. It is proposed to have begun around 3100 BC, with the end of the pre-dynastic period that culminated with the reign of the famous so-called first king of Egypt, Narmer. Before the time of the first kings of Egypt, the country appears to have been divided into at least two different cultural groups comprising Upper and Lower Egypt. The ancient Egyptians called their country the Two Lands. Egypt has long been presented in the mainstream as a fantasy land of mystical people who built impossible monuments and buried innumerable treasures that they protected with zombie mummies and spells. No. The ancient Egyptians were people who had a historical and cultural context, and Egypt had a geographical context. They communicated with and were embedded in the broader world around them. Sometimes this communication was peaceful by means of trade or diplomacy. Other times this communication was violent by means of war and imperialism. The legendary King Narmer may have been responsible for the first unification of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, thus merging the disparate cultures which initiated the development of a complex state. However, even before this development, ancient Egyptians were already in contact with people of far distant foreign lands. At Hierakonpolis, one of the earliest archaeologically attested links between Egypt and a foreign land is represented by a Lapis Lazuli figurine of a standing woman who is clasping her hands. This blue stone does not naturally occur in Egypt. It was imported from eastern Afghanistan from a mine that provided lapis lazuli not only to Egypt, but to much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. However, very early on, concepts of the heroic and victorious king dominated ancient Egyptian iconography. Warfare and submission of non-Egyptians in ancient Egypt was both a reality and an ideology expressed in art and literature, namely in the so-called smiting scenes. In these scenes, which typically appear on the exterior of temple pylons, display a mighty king in the presence of gods holding one or several enemies, typically non-Egyptians, by their hair and preparing to execute them. Smiting scenes persisted for thousands of years, found in the earliest Egyptian art dating before Narmer, all the way through the Roman period. The reason such scenes would appear on the exterior walls of temples was because it was illustrative of subduing chaos and preventing chaos from entering the ordered world of the gods, which was the temple itself. Foreigners had the potential to aggressively penetrate Egyptian borders and therefore had the potential for disrupting cosmic order. Pharaoh needed to maintain both. The hero king is also manifested in commemorative inscriptions that boast of the pharaoh's triumph over a foreign enemy. Such texts are often punctuated by defaming the enemy, by presenting them as weak and uncivilized in order to emphasize the power of the Egyptian king. To stop when attacked is to make bold the foe's heart. Attack is valor, retreat is cowardice. A coward is he who is driven from his border. Since the Nubian listens to the word of mouth, to answer him is to make him retreat. Attack him, he will turn his back. Retreat, he will start attacking. They are not people one respects. They are wretches, craven-hearted. The Boundary Stila of Senwazret III. The Stila's purpose is not necessarily to be read. Indeed, the audience for it would be rather small because most Egyptians were illiterate. Because stelae are made of stone and therefore meant to have longevity far beyond the reign of the king who erected them, they served as extensions of the king himself. His presence is not only established by the physical stela, but also by his names which are carved upon it. Enemies described upon it, both in text and image, are likewise eternally subjugated by the pharaoh. Mernapta turned back the Libyans who trod Egypt. The vile chief, the Libyan foe, fled in the deep of night, alone, no plume on his head, his feet unshod. His wives were carried off from his presence. His food supplies were snatched away. He had no drinking water to sustain him. The gaze of his brothers was fierce to slay him. His officers fought among each other. When he reached his country, he was in mourning. Those left in his land were loath to receive him. The Victory Stela of Mernapta. According to Egyptian texts, there is a certain decorum that is expected in what one may call civilized warfare or fighting with honor. And engaging in war according to the prescribed parameters indicates being civilized. Not adhering to this decorum, which of course is established by the Egyptian king, is a marker for an uncivilized and therefore inferior people. For an Egyptian king not to vanquish such people would be humiliating to his predecessors. A defeat would break the dynastic line and even break cosmic order. This is particularly evident in the records of Ramesses II's battle at Kadesh. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses the Great led a dramatic battle against the Hittite enemy at a site called Kadesh that had been captured by the Hittites who lived in what is now eastern Turkey. Before Ramesses' reign, Kadesh marked the farthest reach of the Egyptian Empire in a very strategic location, bordering the Hittite Empire, situated on the Orontes River that was redirected to form a moat around the fortress. Hoping to reclaim it, Ramesses led 4 army factions northeast to Syria. After capturing Hittite scouts, he was deceived into believing the Hittite army had not yet arrived at the city. Once camped, Ramesses' army was ambushed and a chaotic battle ensued. The events of the battle are recorded in several texts that had been carved on the walls of Egyptian temples, and tell of a harrowing moment where Ramesses was completely cut off from his army and surrounded by the enemy. Afraid, he beseeches the help of the god Amun, and is then given the power to defeat them all. According to the texts, with the arrival of a supporting army, Ramesses defeated the Hittites. The texts are unusual because they depict the pharaoh in a state of weakness. It records that he was not only surrounded, but he was also afraid. A king cannot be afraid. But this was actually a device meant to emphasize his role as the hero king. Despite his fear, it was his inherent royal strength and his faith in the gods that gave him the power to defeat the enemy single-handedly. This is commemorated on the temple walls, not for the average Egyptian citizen to see, but for the gods to see. Ramesses is telling the gods, look at how much faith I have in you, and because of it, you must give me power. It is like an elaborate retelling of the smiting scenes found on temple pylons. The battle itself seems rather to have been a stalemate, but as the hero king, he could not represent himself as anything less than a victor. It is easy to understand how the Egyptians would have projected negative views on active foreign enemies who literally threatened Egypt by means of invasion and rebellion. However, over time, the Egyptians became a cosmopolitan and culturally intermixed civilization. How did the ancient Egyptians distinguish the non-Egyptians from themselves? How manifold it is what you have made, although mysterious in the face of humanity. O sole God without another beside him, you create the earth according to your wish, being alone. People, all large and small animals, all things which are on earth, which go on legs, which rise up and fly by means of their wings, the foreign countries of Haru and Cush, and the land of Egypt. You set every man in his place, you make their requirements, each one having his food and the reckoning of his lifetime. Their tongues differ in speech, their natures likewise. Their skins are distinct, for you have made foreigners to be distinct. The Hymn to the Aten. The term othering is a modern term that scholars use to define how ancient people distinguished themselves from people they considered different from them, and not one that the ancient Egyptians applied to their own perceptions. In modern scholarship, to other another culture means to mark it not only as different, but also as inferior. To do this, one's own cultural identity must be established. This was true for the ancient Egyptians. One must wonder whether Egyptians would have been as aware of their Egyptianness had they not been in contact with cultures different from their own. Would the Egyptians have promoted themselves so vigorously as the center of cosmic order if they never became aware of surrounding civilizations? Is it an inherent aspect of developing civilization to also develop a conscious sense of self as a people as a result of interculturalism? Did Egyptians only see themselves as Egyptian by a method of relativity, meaning this culture does not do what we do, therefore we are Egyptian, and they are not? If they are not Egyptian, then they are other, and thereby a threat both to Egyptianness and by extension to Egypt entirely. But how did they demonstrate this? In royal art, the ancient Egyptians followed a decorum of stereotyped representation, depicting an entire cultural group with a selected set of features that seemed, to the ancient Egyptians, to represent the average individual of a given group. This was illustrated by style of dress, hair treatment, body adornment, skin color, and physiognomy, all of which, for every group, was categorically not Egyptian. The persons depicted were generally Nubians of regions referred to as Wawat and Kush, or modern-day Sudan, Puntites from Eritrea, the people of Yam, which has recently been suggested to be modern-day Chad, and others. The generic Nubian was depicted with black skin, red clothing, usually a sash, ivory armbands and earrings, textured hair that sometimes appears dyed red with ochre, and decorated with an ostrich feather and a distinctive physiognomy. Libyans to the west were, in the New Kingdom period, represented with a long side lock and feather in their hair, colorful patterned cloak, and yellow tattooed skin. Peoples of the Near East were depicted as more varied, with differing styles of dress and hair treatment. The hair and elaborate robes worn by Babylonians and Assyrians are comparable to the depictions of those peoples in Babylonian and Assyrian art. Syrians and Levantines are shown wearing white robes or other colorful garments, and sometimes have beards and shaved heads. The skin color of Near Easterners also tends to be yellow. In the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, Minoans from Crete are also depicted wearing the same colorful kilts, boots, and long flowing hair one finds in Minoan art. In tomb paintings, where envoys are shown bringing trade goods to Egypt, cultural groups are also identified by the objects they bring. People of Punt bring incense trees and baboons. Nubians bring elephant tusks and giraffes. Levantines bring elephant tusks and metal vessels, as well as chariots, horses, and weapons. Minoans bring very prized pottery. While this art does in part convey a certain accuracy, particularly geographical, it must be borne in mind that these depictions are still a product of stereotype. Literature also conveys distinctions between Egyptians and non-Egyptians. In the story of Sinuhe, after the death or murder of Amenemhat, the soldier Sinuhe becomes afraid and he flees to the Levant, where he adopts the customs and builds a life and family. In his old age, he is recalled to Egypt by the succeeding king Senwazret. When he meets the king, no one recognizes him because he looks Levantine. The royal women begin screaming, and then they ritually re-Egyptianize him. I was put in the house of a prince. In it were luxuries, a bathroom and mirrors. In it were riches from the treasury, clothes of royal linen, myrrh, and the choice perfume of the king. Every servant was at his task. Years were removed from my body. I was shaved, my hair was combed. Thus was my squalor returned to the foreign land, my dress to the sandfarers. I was clothed in fine linen, I was anointed with fine oil, I slept on a bed, I had returned the sand to those who dwell in it, the tree oil to those who grease themselves with it. The Story of Sinuhe. Over time, skin color, hair treatment, and tattoos were not necessarily the only mark of othering, as there are occurrences of Egyptians having tattoos, adopting the Nubian hairstyle for wigs, as well as the ever-increasing cosmopolitan aspect of Egypt, which likely led to a spectrum of skin colors. The story of Sinuhe shows that what othered non-Egyptians the most was their style of dress, and especially language. Skin color, hairstyle, and body adornment were secondary characteristics of otherness. In his Book of the Dead papyrus, Myher Perry is shown with varying degrees of dark brown to black skin, but his Nubian-style dress, the red sash, and the jewelry is what identifies him as Nubian to the viewer.
Whatever Myher Perry's skin color was, it didn't matter, because he was Egyptianized. His coffin represents him as an Egyptian, but in his Book of the Dead papyrus, he is clearly Nubian, reflected by his clothes and his jewelry. However, his language was Egyptian, and this was more important. He could speak and read and write ancient Egyptian. In the story of Sinuhe, what truly sparked Sinuhe's nostalgia for Egypt was hearing his mother tongue for the first time in decades. Mynheer Perry was Egyptian, and he received the highest honor that a non-royal could receive in ancient Egypt. He was granted a traditionally Egyptian burial in the royal necropolis among the king's tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This is an honor purely for Egyptians. We know this because, again, it is recorded in the story of Sinuhe.
A stone pyramid was built for me in the midst of the pyramids. The masons who build tombs constructed it. A master draftsman designed in it. A master sculptor carved in it. The overseers of construction in the necropolis busied themselves with it. All the equipment that is placed in a tomb shaft was supplied. Mortuary priests were given me. A funerary domain was made for me. There is no commoner for whom the like has been done. I was in the favor of the king until the day of landing came. The Story of Sinuhe.
However, the matter of having himself represented as Nubian may have been a way to ensure that the gods recognized him in the afterlife. Or maybe even to boast to other Egyptians that in spite of being perceived as a foreigner, he still received the highest honor.
There were two opposing conceptions about non-Egyptians. On the one hand, they were viewed as chaotic forces meant to be controlled for the preservation of the cosmos. On the other hand, they contributed to the Egyptian civilization through trade of luxury goods. What was their place within Egypt as a land foreign to them, and what was their place in Egyptian society? Then Atta came to the south. His fate brought on his doom. The gods of Upper Egypt grasped him. He was found by His Majesty. His Majesty carried him off as a living captive, and all his people as booty. I brought 2 young warriors as captives from the ship of Atta. Then I was given 5 persons and portions of land. The same was done for the whole crew. The biography of Ahmose son of Ebana.
The uncomfortable and inglorious truth is that evidence exists of ancient Egyptian royals and non-royal elites objectifying other humans. This was mostly a product of war, but also a product of diplomacy. Foreign kings would send people as luxury goods to Egyptian kings as a means to maintain diplomatic ties. The Amarna letters from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten record numerous examples of this.
The Amarna letters collection is an archive of over 380 clay tablet letters written in the cuneiform script that were sent from foreign kings of the Near East as well as vassals from the Levant. Letters from the kings generally centered around matters of diplomacy, but also inventory lists have been found that detail massive amounts of luxury goods sent as greeting gifts or dowries. Among them, sometimes men and women were sent as gifts. One king's daughter was sent to marry Amenhotep III, and she brought with her an entourage of over 300 women. What happened to these women when they arrived at the royal court is a mystery. Perhaps they were married off to Egyptian men of the upper class. Other people were brought from foreign lands to be used as entertainment. An example of this is found in the Old Kingdom tomb of Harkuf, who was charged by child King Pepi II to venture further south into Africa to retrieve a pygmy. Come north to the residence at once. Hurry and bring with you this pygmy whom you brought from the land of the horizon dwellers, live, hale, and healthy, for the dances of the gods, to gladden the heart, to delight the heart of King Pepi II, who lives forever. When he goes down with you into the ship, get worthy men to be around him on deck, lest he fall into the water. When he lies down at night, get worthy men to lie around him in his tent. Inspect 10 times at night. My Majesty desires to see this pygmy, more than the gifts of the mainland and of Punt. The biography of Harkhuf. During the reign of 18th dynasty King Thutmose III, a new form of Egyptianization was introduced. In order to maintain influence in the Levant as well as in Nubia, young sons of the rulers of city-states or chiefdoms were brought or sent from their homes to be reared in the Egyptian king's court. They would be educated in Egyptian customs, language, and writing, and indoctrinated in Egyptian religion. Then they would return to their homeland, Egyptianized, and thereby more malleable to the demands of the Egyptian king. But what about foreign influence on Egyptian identity? Military weapons such as a double-curved bow and the chariot, along with the horse, were accepted and integrated into Egyptian military technology. This was probably a necessity because the Egyptians were thrown into war with people who possessed these technologies and who eventually came to rule northern Egypt. These people were the Hyksos, originating from the Levantine region. They formed the 15th dynasty during the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos kings ruled concomitantly with the Egyptian kings of the 17th dynasty.
The art of the Second Intermediate Period is relatively scant, but what seems to be the case is that chariots and horses not only suddenly appear in Egyptian art, but they become dominant in Egyptian art. They emerge as an integral feature of kingship within the last one or two reigns of the 17th dynasty, and then continue throughout the rest of Egyptian history. These were technologies that restored the image of the hero king after using them against the very people who introduced them to Egypt.
Militaristic ventures were behind much of non-Egyptian settlement in Egypt. Mastery of the bow appeared to be primarily a Nubian talent, and these Nubian soldiers were often incorporated into the Egyptian army, specifically as ranged weapon specialists. These Nubian archers settled in Egypt and in some cases married Egyptian women. While this might indicate they were Egyptianized, there is much evidence that their Nubian culture was retained in their funerary art, similar to the Book of the Dead of Meher Perry. The funerary stela of Nenu depicts Nenu as Nubian, identified not only by the text that explicitly states he is Nubian, but also by the red sash that adorns his waist. He holds a bow identifying his profession. More interesting are the identities of his family members. Possibly they are his children, but rather than being represented as Egyptian, they are represented as Nubian. Again, this is based on their style of dress. The son wears a red sash, while the daughter wears a long red skirt. But Nenu's wife is conspicuously Egyptian, distinguished particularly by her traditional white sheath dress worn by Egyptian women. Assuming the family members are the children of Nenu and his wife, it is clear that while they are obviously Nubian, they are also Egyptian. Egypt's worldview was constantly changing as Egypt became a melting pot of different peoples. In the later periods of ancient Egyptian history, the very people who were once used as tropes representing chaos came to rule Egypt. The Libyans of the Third Intermediate Period, followed by the great Nubian kings of the 25th dynasty. The Persians took their turn and were followed by the kings Ptolemy, and then the Roman Empire. The last Egyptian to sit on the throne was Nectanebo II, whose reign ended in 343 BC. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Lives on the Nile.